Nope. Oh, I'm on.
How did you turn it on?
I don't know. Now I'm off. Test. I think you touch it.
Yeah.
No.
Greetings, everybody. I'll just give you a moment or two to get settled and allow a few more people to come into the room, because this is going to be a really nice session, and we really want you to kind of feel that you're part of something truly special. So just give us a moment or two, allow people to come in, and then we'll get the first session of sub-theme 2, on the road. Just to remind you what sub-theme 2 is all about. Is everybody familiar with sub-theme 2? Nod if you're familiar. If you're not, just stare at me like, hey, who's this guy? Well, it's nature-based solutions for climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and biodiversity conservation. Okay, sounds simple, but what does it mean in practice? Well, we're going to work on that in this session. Let me tell you who I am. I'm Henry Bonsu. Very simple name, Henry. English king, Henry VIII. 6 wives, all of that, you know. But I'm about so much more than just Henry VIII. Henry Bonsu. Surname Bonsu is from Ghana. Those of you who know West Africa and know Ghana, it means whale. This great big mammal in the sea that we want to conserve. It's because one of my ancestors apparently was so mighty and great, he had defeated everything on land. And so people said the only thing mightier than him is in the sea, the whale. So my name is Henry the Whale. Okay. And I'm going to be your moderator for the next 90 or so minutes. I'll be speaking in English, but not everybody will. One of our speakers will be speaking in Spanish, and there are translation services for French, of course, Spanish, and indeed our host, a Korean language. And this sub-theme is going to review how much progress we're making on nature-based solutions and set these, this is the important things, against the pledges that are made at international summits from Rio to Glasgow. Remember Rio 1992, and then we had Glasgow last year, COP26. So we're going to focus on relevant, practical experience. We want to generate insights on how forests can contribute to the implementation of international agreements. It's one thing to say these things, what happens in between COP25 and COP26 and COP26 and COP27, and then how we can raise the ambition of forest-related nature-based solutions. We say they can do A, but can they do B? And remember, this is the first of 5 sessions in this sub-theme. The other ones, one will be on sustainably managed forests, another one on global restoration, programs, nature-based solutions from forests for climate change, and then genetic resources and management of pests. Very interesting, that one. So we're going to set the scene for sub-theme 2. Essentially, it's setting the theme for the whole week of activities in this sub-theme by introducing state-of-the-art nature-based solutions and explaining why they are critical for people and planet. So in this session now, we're going to have 2 keynote presentations, a virtual one, which you'll be able to see on screen, from the Executive Director of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the other live on stage from a professor who's at the forefront of nature-based solutions as holistic solutions to mitigate climate change, to conserve biodiversity, and build resilience for food security. So we've got 2 keynote presentations, okay? And they're going to essentially highlight the benefits for governments, multilateral organizations, the private sector, and other non-state actors. You know, why should they commit more support to these nature-based solutions? So we're going to have the proof in this session, okay? We're also going to align these with pledges of the major conventions and recognize, and we've heard this quite a bit today, and support the role of indigenous peoples and local communities who've had the knowledge for thousands of years. They're the custodians, often marginalized, often not fully appreciated. We need to change that. So after those 2 keynote presentations, we will have a panel with 3 stakeholders who've got diverse perspectives. We'll have a coordinator of indigenous peoples groups in the Amazon, an environment and social inclusion leader at a European investment firm. They're both in the room. You can raise your hands, guys. Yes, okay, just so people know who you are. And a specialist in forest food systems and people, and she's from Kenya, and she will be joining us virtually. So it's going to be a really stimulating and dynamic session. You're going to feel as though this room is full. You're going to feel connected. You're going to feel inspired, and you're going to feel engaged. Okay? Are we agreed? Yes. And then also, when we've heard from them, you will be able to connect with us by asking questions. But first, we need to define what we mean by nature-based solutions. Anybody got a good definition? Anybody? Nature-based solutions? I'm looking for anybody who can define it. Right. I will define it for you. Because, as luck would have it, a multilaterally agreed definition was adopted at the 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi just 2 months ago, almost to the day. They say this: nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified terrestrial freshwater, coastal and marine ecosystems which address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefits. So it's broad, but it's also specific. So that's enough from me for now. Let's hear from our first keynote speaker. She is Elizabeth Maruma Murewa, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, Elizabeth has a 20-year track record of service with UNEP, holding senior positions in legal and ecosystems divisions before taking on her current role. Now, she believes this year humanity stands at a crossroads. Let's hear why right now. Please run the tape of Elizabeth.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is a pleasure to speak to you today. I extend my congratulations to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and our host, the Korea Forest Service of the Government of the Republic of Korea, for their hard work and support for successfully organizing this event during these challenging times. At the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat, we have enjoyed long-term fruitful partnership with both agencies, and I highlight with gratitude the substantial financial support received from the Korea Forest Service since 2015 for the implementation of the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative. The past few years have been difficult for forests, and certainly for people as well. While we have been grappling with the pandemic, forests have continued to disappear at an accelerated pace, and the effects of climate change are being felt globally. We know that these issues are far from being disconnected and must be addressed holistically. The year 2020 marked the end of the UN Decade on Biodiversity and the Strategic Plan. We have seen remarkable progress in actions to conserve biodiversity and promote its sustainable use. Yet, as evidenced in the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, these efforts have been insufficient to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. While deforestation has slowed in places, we are still far from reaching the objective of halting it completely. Some 10 million hectares, equivalent to the land of the South Korea, are still deforested globally every year, mostly for agricultural uses. Depleted biodiversity, unsustainable wildlife trade, deforestation, and forest degradation create healthy and safety risks that affect us all and impact the poor and disadvantaged the hardest. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, currently under negotiations by the Convention on Biological Diversity parties, aim to stabilize or reverse trends of biodiversity loss by 2030 and foster the recovery of natural ecosystems to achieve a vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The recently completed meetings in Geneva highlighted again that there will be a strong role for forests in the implementation of the future biodiversity framework, in particular the protection, restoration, and sustainable use of forest ecosystems. Parties will also consider how to reduce incentives and subsidies harmful to biodiversity as part of this new framework when they finalize it in Kunming, China later this year. Improvement in natural and managed ecosystems worldwide is envisaged in the ambition for 2030 in line with other globally agreed goals, in particular Sustainable Development Goal SDG 15 for life on land, the Paris Agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, land degradation neutrality under the UN Convention to combat desertification, and the UN Strategic Plan for Forests, among others. Sustainable forest management presents an important opportunity to demonstrate synergies across the 3 Rio Conventions in addressing the planet's multiple and interlinked crises. Research shows that nature-based solutions can provide up to 1/3 of the cost-effective mitigation by 2030. With appropriate safeguards, these solutions could also enhance a wide range of ecosystem services, including water filtration, flood and coastal protection, and soil health, as well as contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Yet, despite their potential, the efforts to conserve and sustainably use forests only receive about 2% of the global climate finance. We cannot effectively address the impacts of climate change without reducing deforestation and protecting, restoring, and sustainably using forests. Policies, economic incentives for ecosystem-based approaches to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and disaster risk reduction should be based on the best scientific and traditional knowledge and must also be developed with the full and effective involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities. In this way, managed forests can act as a nature-based solutions, improving biodiversity while supplying clean water and air, protecting against extreme weather events and landslides, and helping to regulate the climate by removing and storing carbon from the atmosphere. We need to protect, restore, and use our forests sustainably, making use of ecological principles and fostering a diversity of species. In this way, nature will continue to nurture and sustain our life as it has always been. The remainder of the year 2022 will be decisive in these efforts. This year sees humanity standing at the crossroads towards the sustainability pathway, as we will witness through the meetings of the Conference of the Parties for all the 3 Rio Conventions and the Stockholm Plus 50, marking the 15th anniversary of the meeting that gave birth to the United Nations Environment Programme. I invite all of you, together with the stakeholders and partners around the world, to set our ambitions high for the transformative change this planet critically needs. Thank you.
Well, come on, yes, I think we... Is my microphone on? Yeah. I mean, that was a tremendous contribution there from the Executive Director of the CBD, Elizabeth Marua Marema. What I got from that was, we know so much about what the forests do for us. We have all the data. We've tracked it. It protects us, it nurtures us. It has done for thousands of years, and yet still, we're not doing what we need to do. The question is why? And how do we change in 2022 with all these conventions coming together? So let's move to our second keynote speaker, who will be here live in the room. Deborah Lawrence is a professor of environmental sciences and director of environmental thought and practice at the University of Virginia, USA. She is widely published and recognized for her research on tropical deforestation and climate change. Professor Lawrence worked on forests and climate in the State Department of the USA, the US Forest Service, and USAID under President Obama. And there she is. Deborah is going to give us fresh insights on the role of forests in climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Republic of Korea and to FAO for putting on this incredible conference. So I feel like we already heard in the last speaker's presentation a lot of the good science we know. I'm going to tell you some new science that's really just telling us what we already do know, which is that forests are more than CO2. Forests are important for mitigation, and that's part of that carbon story, but also there's more than just carbon that forests do to keep us cool. We're also interested in forests as critical parts of our struggle for adaptation and for resilience. So you all know that forests are made of CO2. Like all plants, they take up CO2 from the atmosphere. And the forests that we have store carbon every year and more carbon every year, ultimately taking up to a quarter of the carbon dioxide that we emit every year. So forests are taking up carbon dioxide up to 1/4 of what we produce. They are this important sink, drawing down 16 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. But forests are also emitters. So they emit about 8 gigatons. What that means, if they were a country, is that they would be the second largest emitter in the world, after China and before the US. So forests could be doing more if we were not deforesting and degrading them. So instead of 16 gigatons of mitigation every year, we only get 8. But over time, what forests have done is a lot. If you put on one side of the balance all of the carbon stored in forests, in their vegetation and in the soils, it's about the same as all of the CO2 stored in extractable fossil reserves. We know those fossil reserves need to stay in the ground if we're going to meet our target of limiting warming to 1.5. Similarly, forests need to remain standing. Without forests, we would already be living in a much hotter world. So right now, we've seen 1 degree of warming. If all the forests of the world were gone, we would already be past 1.5 degrees of warming. So I'm just saying this to remind you, forests are critical in our fight against climate change. But forests do much more than store carbon. Forests also regulate the climate by moving water. They absorb energy from the sun because they have low albedo, they're dark, they absorb energy, and they take that energy and transform water from liquid coming out of the soil into water vapor as it leaves the leaf and enters the atmosphere. That process of evaporation cools the air above the forest, and ultimately it cools not just the forest region, but the broader region. And in fact, this process of evaporation, evapotranspiration, it cools the planet. It cools the surface temperature. The physical structure of the forest also cools us. This is showing you how normally the air would flow across a smooth surface and there's not a lot of mixing, so hot air stays relatively stable at the surface. Forests, on the other hand, they have a complex canopy, a large physical structure, and as air parcels move over the forest canopy, they become turbulent, and that turbulence helps lift that air from the surface higher into the atmosphere. It takes heat away from us, where we live, and moves it up into the atmosphere. That's a feature called canopy roughness. Forest chemistry also cools the air. How does that work? Well, biogenic volatile organic carbon compounds create aerosols. Those aerosols are reflective. So imagine having, it's sort of like an invisible shield over the forest. Each of those particles reflects energy that would have come into the planet back into space. Those aerosols also create clouds, and the clouds, of course, reflect sunlight that comes in back into space. Both of these are cooling mechanisms. If you add up all these biophysical aspects, they actually contribute a lot of extra mitigation for global temperature. What I'm showing you here in blue is the amount of carbon dioxide that would be released if we deforested that entire band of latitude. So each band of latitude has a certain amount of carbon dioxide stored in the forest. What you get from that is a certain amount of warming when you take those forests away. That's in blue. In black is the amount of warming you get when you take those forests away due to the other effects, the biophysical effects, not CO2. I'm talking about roughness and albedo and evapotranspiration and biogenic volatile organic compounds. That is a significant, those black bars are quite significant. And up to 50 degrees of latitude, they're like a bonus. They are a bonus for cooling. The forests are delivering that service to us, and we do not consider them. We don't talk about that cooling effect. It's not part of the policy conversation. So, forests are more than carbon. Forests do these other things as well that cool the planet, but also forests regulate more than temperature. So the forests absorbing energy and transforming energy and water, that gives us rainfall. So rainfall that falls not only over the forest region, but rainfall that falls over the agriculture, which often replaces the forest. And if you look at studies of model deforestation, it turns out that across the tropics, if you remove forests, rainfall declines by 10 to 15%. This is key because in much of the tropics, agriculture is not irrigated. It's dependent on rainfall. So 10 to 15% decline is quite significant indeed. But it's not just what's happening in the tropics. In fact, if you deforest the tropics, you can affect rainfall around the world. What I'm showing you here is the results of what happens if you deforest the Amazon. A triangle means a place where you see less rainfall. A circle is a place where you see more rainfall. Don't focus too hard, just notice that there are changes throughout the world. Deforest Central Africa, you get effects also throughout the world. Deforest Southeast Asia, also remote impacts on rainfall. So, forest climate benefits. It regulates temperature, forests regulate rainfall, but there's also impacts that go beyond the global. Right? It's not just about what forests do for our global well-being. Forests are critical for adaptation and resilience because forests stabilize local climate. So here I'm showing you some results of a literature review on the effects of just comparing forested land and unforested land right in the same place. What you can see is that if you compare the two, forests result in a much cooler daily temperature. So here I'm showing the results for deforestation. You get 1 to 8 degrees C hotter temperatures in the daytime. That's a lot, and this is an average for the entire year. Imagine what that means for maximum temperature. It's also true that you get a warmer warm season or a warmer dry season by 1 to 5 degrees on average. These are big impacts of forests. This is a local impact felt right there. So forests also, they don't just change the mean, they don't just change the seasonal, they change extreme temperatures. So forests keep us with a lower daily maximum, a lower daily average, with less severe, shorter and fewer hot periods, shorter dry periods, and lower flood risk. These are serious, serious benefits of forests. So when I think about forests, I think they don't just minimize extreme weather, they minimize risk and vulnerability. This, after all, this weather and extreme weather, that is what we live in. That is what we live in, what our crops grow in, what the natural ecosystems that we depend upon experience. This weather is very important, and forests stabilize it. So forests, they're good for mitigation. That mitigation is more than carbon. Those biophysical effects I show you, they deliver cooling. They deliver cooling locally, and they deliver it globally. The local effects of forests are key for adaptation and resilience. So forests, I can't say it enough, they are essential. They are essential for global mitigation, for local adaptation, and for resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Deborah. Deborah, stay there for a second. I want to ask you a quick... I love the conviction and the passion and the data and the science. You sound a little bit frustrated, I think, that this is something that you know that you've been working on. Is there resistance to accepting that forests are doing more than just capturing carbon? Is there resistance?
Well, I think the indigenous people in the room would say, we have known this forever.
Yes.
So they're not resisting. There's just, we know that the problem with our climate is CO2, and it's from fossil fuels. Yes. So when we think about fixing the climate, we think about CO2. That is completely true for our fossil fuel problem. It's just that there are these other ways to change the temperature of the planet, and they're not CO2. So they don't fit neatly into that conversation about fossil fuels. So I think that's why we focus on CO2, which is fine. It's where we should begin. But forests have such an important role to play, and these physical impacts are really critical for adaptation and resilience locally.
Thank you very much, Deborah Lawrence. For the moment, thank you very much. And if you have any questions for Deborah, I'm sure you do, then hold on to them, because we'll be doing a Q&A a little bit later on when we've heard from our next speakers. Let's move to our panel. Two of them are here. One of them will be joining us virtually. On my immediate left is Juan Carlos Hintiach, who is a technical advisor on climate change, biodiversity, and international policy and cooperation for the COICA, which is the Coordination of the Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin. Juan Carlos, thank you very much for being here. We also have to your left Michael Schlupp, who is the head of Impact and ESG and a founding director of Sail Ventures, which is a Netherlands-based boutique asset manager investing in real assets for real impact. And joining us virtually, I don't know if we can see her yet, is Dr. Susan Chomba, who is the director of Vital Landscapes for Africa at the World Resources Institute, and she leads the institution's work on forests, food systems, and people, and this includes forest landscape restoration, sustainable agriculture and food systems, and thriving rural livelihoods in Africa. So let's have a round of applause for our panel. Fantastic. Okay, so Juan Carlos is going to speak in Spanish. So if you're not a Spanish speaker, and I'm not, if you'd spoken in German or French or Chi, the Ghanaian language, I would be fine, but I'm not. So therefore, I'm going to put my headset on. Juan Carlos, I'm going to ask you a question, okay, to start off with. Because we've heard a lot. I mean, we launched the State of the World's Forests earlier today, and people were being very, very effusive in their support for the indigenous peoples and their knowledge, and determined that they should be supported to bring that knowledge to the benefit of everybody. But you have been incredibly effective at bringing fundamental issues of indigenous rights to the center of global climate policy negotiations and discussions on what we now agree are nature-based solutions. So tell us what is needed now for nature-based solutions to deliver for indigenous peoples, because you've been delivering for everybody else. It's on already.
Hola. Muchas
Thank you very much, Henry, for the introduction and question. It is a great honor to have been invited. I would like to thank FAO and Korea Forest Service for this invitation, and it is my great honor to be here. I think there is one critical thing that must be understood. The indigenous people and the local communities have lived in these areas for a long time. We are part of the nature. And Even before the legal processes were instituted, we were there as residents. Conserving forests is very important. And its importance has been proven by Western natural science, and it is very important for the local community. But for us, when we talk about the forest, it's really about the spiritual aspects, not just the science. There are so many local people living in these areas, and for them, the forests are very, very valuable and important. There are many approaches, such as Red Plus and Red Plus Plus, and they have been proposed as solutions, but the local community has said this. Red could be about fisheries and any other issues, but for us, we've been focusing on forests. And in the indigenous communities, we have our own ways, and we have our own initiatives. Within the Amazon region, we've been engaging in activities in order to respond to the current issues that we face in the forest. And we see the current situation as a disaster, and we wanted to actively engage in solving these challenges. And of course, a scientific approach is important, but we want to have our local perspectives integrated into a scientific approach. The benefits that trees provide, you can see that. But for us, trees are living beings, living organisms, and they heal us, and they give us spiritual inspiration. So I think this is a cosmo vision, and trees have spirits. We don't just fell trees randomly. We ask for permission from nature to cut trees. And that is our approach to nature. Therefore, when we talk about biodiversity or when we talk about natural conservation, we need to take all of these into consideration. So how efficiently we are already addressing these issues should be taken into consideration in international dialogue.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that, Juan Carlos. For those people who are not familiar with RED or RED Plus, it's reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It's enshrined in Paris Agreement Article 5. And what they created with RED Plus and Indigena to translate something global into something that worked for them was incredibly innovative. So hats off to you, Juan Carlos, and we'll come back to you a little bit later on. But let's move now then from the spirituality of the people who are custodians of the forest, and I like the idea of you when you see, I mean, I myself too, okay, although I'm born and raised in the UK, I come from a mighty people in West Africa, the Ashanti people. And I too, when I see a tree, I feel connected. I feel this is a living, organic being. I maybe don't engage with it in quite the same way as you, but I appreciate it. I'm now going to move to Michael by way of contrast. Michael, it does not mean that you do not appreciate the tree. He's from the Netherlands. They have trees there too. But Michael is with Sail Ventures. He's a founding director, probably best known for Anne Green, and has been one of the innovative investment firms promoting forest-positive agriculture. And they have $180 million US dollars of blended finance fund, and they invest in transformational commercial projects that decouple tropical agricultural commodity production from deforestation. So, big contrast with what Juan Carlos is doing, but we want to align them together. That's why we're sitting together here. So, Michael, first question to you. What are the major new opportunities and challenges for private sector organizations like yourselves to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity conservation through nature-based solutions? Because when I hear of impact funds and venture funds, etc., I see them as a million miles away from the mighty tree in the mighty Amazon that's protecting us all. But you can change my mind.
I shall try.
Yes.
I shall try. And let me assure you that you know, as well as myself, as well as our investors and you know, the investees, the projects we invest in, the companies that we invest in, they're all connected
Yes.
to the forest and to the trees. And I think everybody sees the forest as something that's valuable.
Yes.
The question is just, you know, how do you deploy capital? How do you deploy private sector capital, commercial capital, you know, to actually in a forest positive way? How do you do that? So you've mentioned it, you know, we manage a fund called Green. That's a blended finance fund of the 180 million that we have committed to us. 143 million are invested into, you know, you could say nature-based solutions, sustainably using resources. Our focus is on the difficult commodities, soy, cattle, palm oil, you know, the ones that we really need to decouple from deforestation. And we also focus on large actors, you know, the ones that are primarily responsible for the problem. So you could ask us, you know, are these nature-based solutions or are these nature's problems?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, from the perspective where we come from as an investor, you know, or where our investees sit, the projects we invest in, to protect the forest needs to have a value for them. And, you know, that creates the incentive to change.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, from a commercial perspective, purely commercial perspective, and you know, don't take this wrong, you know, standing forest has no value if you're a commodity producer. So we need to change that paradigm. We need to give the standing forest a value, and you know, not spiritual value, because I think that undoubtedly, as I said, everybody sees, but a commercial value. So how do we do that? How do we give commercial value to a forest? We do it by changing the way we finance these projects. We provide projects with long-term credit that is otherwise not available in the market. You know, this helps the companies that we finance to make the transition to sustainable land use, to really create the incentive, set that in the right way. Because long-term credit matches the long-term costs that you need to shift the way you produce in agriculture. You know, it creates the incentive for this shift. So, you know, if you want an example or two, you know, in Brazil, for example, we have financed a 140,000 hectare cattle ranch. On that cattle ranch, you know, they used to roam cattle quite freely. Now they are integrating the production of soy into the cattle lands, which both restores the soil, but also it, of course, improves the production. It's a process of 8 years. No bank will finance you for 8 years in Brazil, even if you're a large corporate farmer like our client. So through our financing, you know, that transition can happen, that transition to something that is truly sustainable. And in addition to that, you know, we get contractual commitments from the company to protect all the 70,000 hectares of forest that are still on this farm, and, you know, preserve that going forward. Alternatively, you know, in Indonesia, maybe more a bit focused on smallholders and social inclusion, we are financing a mill. We are financing a small plantation that wants to put up a mill because the next mill is 100 kilometers away. And, you know, through that mill, they, of course, keep more value in their hand. They can give more value to the smallholder farmers that supply them. But in exchange, they need to give us a commitment not only to protect the forest on their plantation, but help the smallholder farmers keep protecting the forest on their lands, the supplying smallholder farmers that give them palm oil food. So we always look for these transformational change opportunities in our financing, you know, financing the protection of forest, but also financing production, financing social inclusion, and really creating win-win situations. Because win-win situations are good for people, the planet, and profit. They're also good for us, because the way we want to finance this is in a commercial way, so that we, as a fund, can make a return.
Tremendous, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for that. I like the fact that you gave us 2 concrete examples, and you can see in glorious Technicolor, Susan Chomba. I don't know if Susan is aware that her face has been magnified in our screens for the past half hour. So thankfully she hasn't done anything embarrassing, but she's got a lovely, beautiful green canopy behind her. So Susan, we're going to come to you in just a moment, but I just quickly want to ask Juan Carlos what he made of those 2 concrete examples, particularly the Brazilian one, where cattle used to roam free, but now there's cattle and soy, and it's regenerative. Is that the kind of thing you want to see more of?
I think this is a very important question. We don't just talk about this. We have our principles and we respect these initiatives. We cannot do what is not right. We set our principles and we believe that we need to follow our priorities. And for example, in raising cattle, there are certain priorities. When the fund is formed and these funds will have an impact on the local communities, sometimes they could have a negative impact because the principle of respecting the local community is not always observed. And sometimes these funds might not have enough respect for the lives of the local communities. We live in jungles and we live in forests, and we all live very freely in forests. And due to the living organisms in these forests, we are able to continue with our lives. But sometimes the priorities or the principles are not properly observed. So this is what I'd like to say about that question.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Juan Carlos. Okay, Michael, you can come back a little bit later on. Okay, I don't think he was pushed back directly against you. I think broadly he said, well, this sounds good, but there are other funds which invest in a negative way with negative outputs, I think. Now, we can now move to Susan, who we can see on our screens there. And Susan works with WRI Africa. I think you're in Nairobi, Kenya. Is that right, I think, Susan? And you've worked, for a long time with communities restoring landscapes across the African continent. So here's a question. I mean, how can we shift from this focus on the numbers of hectares restored, because people talk about that all the time and give us these great figures. But what about the real people on the ground for whom this data and these figures may be meaningless when compared with what they have to deal with on the day-to-day? Fundamentally, issues of equity. How do we put those at the center of nature-based solutions? Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Henry. And as well, I'd like to really appreciate the organizers of this session. So let me just mention here that at least we have more than 300 million local communities who are either living within forest areas or areas that are considered to be areas that should be restored back to forests or to natural ecosystems. So And these 300 million local communities in the global south do not have necessarily the view of the professor scientist who really eloquently put together fantastic scientific facts on the role of forests. Neither do they all necessarily fall within the category that we would call indigenous communities. They are local communities, but not everybody nowadays will probably resonate with a strong spiritual connection of forests to whatever, to their own livelihoods. I'm saying there's not connection, but that is not their primary reason or their primary goal of why they protect or restore forests. And neither will they probably have the millions or billions of dollars, access to those millions and billions of dollars that are being put by the private sector to keep the forest standing. So where do these then 300 million people fall, and how do they see and use forests? I think that is the critical question, Henry. If we need to stop looking at forests primarily as carbon, as forests as primarily something for sequestering carbon. So 300 million local communities in the global south, a lot of them will see forests for their value in terms of providing food, providing fodder, providing energy for cooking, providing the rainfall and water and streams that they are using for agriculture. It doesn't mean that when they are protecting forests, they are not generating other ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration and biodiversity. But that is not necessarily from our work engagement with local communities, research on prioritizing local values for forests. It's more to do with what they see as immediate functions and value of forests in their livelihoods. And so to be able to shift our priorities from just the hectares that are restored, we need to start asking how much are forests providing to local livelihoods, how much are they providing in terms of income for local communities, whether it's income through sale of forest and timber and non-timber forest products, how much are they providing local communities in terms of health and nutritional benefits, how much are they providing local communities in terms of energy access. A majority of rural women in Africa are still using firewood and charcoal as a primary source of energy. And if forests disappear, these people, they have to go even further and further away, wasting valuable time that they could be using for other productive uses in the household and in the community. And so until we start really quantifying and valuing and paying for those services as well, or at least making those services that forests are providing for these local communities meaningful, then the idea of really restoring and protecting forests for the rest of the world still remains a far-fetched dream. I also like to connect what the professor talked about, the role of agriculture and forests, because I feel even big international organizations, research organizations, we tend to have different ministries, Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Agriculture, separate Food and Agriculture Organization should be having FAO discussions between agriculture and food should be interconnected. Our own research partners, we need to be making these connections more closely. At the local level, the farmers know that very well, that for the forest, without the forest, they will lose the water that they use either for irrigation or even the rainfall that is supposed to then help their crops grow. But also more importantly, it's to be able to provide other benefits that the farmers get from the forest to be able to produce agriculture in a sustainable manner. So without those connections at the global level, then what we are saying is agriculture as the primary driver of deforestation, we are not addressing that. And how do we address that? From the work that I've been seeing, Henry, that to be able to shift the narrative from those hectares restored, we have to say, how do we make agriculture more sustainable? How do we support farmers, for instance, to restore degraded lands? We know there are technologies such as agroforestry. We have technologies such as farmer-managed natural regeneration, soil and water conservation that can help make agricultural land that the farmers have already converted to be more productive in order to release or ease the pressure from primary forests. So making those connections and ensuring that even our global supply chains are not driving deforestation. So it's not just local agriculture, it's also what, again, I want to relate what was mentioned about, for instance, soy or palm oil or other commodity, global supply commodities that are driving deforestation in the global south that we need to address. And with that, we can stop focusing on just the number of hectares that we are restoring to actually making substantive changes in terms of the way we are valuing and paying for the forest, and also changing our agricultural system to be more sustainable so that it's not driving deforestation.
Susan, thank you very much for that. I've got a follow-up question, which I'm going to put to you, and I'll put to our colleagues as well. We're talking about forest-based, nature-based solutions, and I think we agree that they should be promoted in practice. The question is, given what you've said, how can we do so in a meaningful way for those, whether it's smallholders or forest dwellers or people working in those environments, for whom the words of our professor or our venture capitalists, benign, I don't know, benign. Sorry, I can't quite see your face, but I don't mean that. Yeah. Maybe meaningless if they don't see benefits. How on earth then do we promote it in a way that will persuade them that there's something in it for them, it's going to help them with their livelihoods, with their family, with their futures? How on earth do we do that then? Susan.
I think, Henry, there's no question that we have to make the forest valuable and pay for local communities, whether it's through public or private financing models. Because if we don't make trees that are standing and forests that are standing provide economic benefits for poor, let me just use the word, poor local communities, then perhaps all that we are talking may not be meaningful at the end. We know that there are local benefits that they get, but also considering all the ecosystem services that the forests are providing, we have to ensure that those funds reach local communities. I'll give you an example. We are currently mobilizing at least $2 billion for restoring agricultural lands and other forest areas in Africa. Where does that money go? We had big promises during COP26 in Glasgow. It was deemed the COP for nature. Big commitments, financial commitments. If that money is not going to local communities on the ground, poor communities who then should be able to be investing that money in sustainable land management practices as well as other socioeconomic values, where should that money go? So let's get that right, that we have to ensure public, private, blended finance models that are supposed to help us to address climate change or biodiversity. It has to reach local communities. And that's one of the challenges that we are having. We are hearing big numbers in big conferences, but very little that is going on the ground. Secondly, Henry, and a quick one, that for every project that we are designing with local communities, they have to have a broader agenda in mind and not just carbon. And that's what I was mentioning. We have to look at the livelihood benefits. We have to co-design these projects with local communities. We have to tap into their local and indigenous knowledge. If we are working in indigenous people's territories, let their priorities, their wisdom, their advice guide us, and not pretend that we have the solutions to local problems, even for some of us who don't understand a lot of these local dynamics. So funds must reach local communities, but secondly, we have to be humble enough as external, whether it's scientists, development actors, or other institutions, to co-design these programs with the respect of local knowledge, with tapping local knowledge, respect of indigenous knowledge, so that we have more meaningful and sustainable results on the ground.
Susan, thank you. Michael, I have to go straight to you then. As Susan was speaking, were you nodding your head, going, yes, 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 this is exactly what we did in Brazil and Indonesia, or were you bristling? Did you feel, please don't tell us how to do this, because we know this is something we're experts in? What was your response to that? And how would you develop that point further? How can forest-based, nature-based solutions be promoted in practice if it isn't essentially what Susan was saying?
Yeah, no, I wasn't nodding my head. I think I was in thought.
And what did your thoughts lead you to conclude?
Susan put her finger on a very sore point, right? Okay. The fact that we hear a lot about money has to be mobilized, or money has to be deployed, to help the forest. But before you can deploy money, you first need to mobilize it. And it's a sore point for me as well, because, in 5 years we have been managing this fund. We have raised 180 million. That sounds maybe like a lot, but quite frankly, for the scale of the problem that we're dealing with, it's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean. And it was, oh boy, it was frustrating and difficult to raise these 180 million. The 180 million that we have are actually from blended finance sources, so we have capital from governments, from Norway, from the UK, from development banks, from FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, from private companies, from Unilever. So we have, you know, different ways of capital, but all of this capital was given to us in a catalytic way to prove that we can create a portfolio that actually, you know, protects forests, includes people into value chains, and at the same time, you know, stimulates food production, because that's an important problem we haven't talked about, but I guarantee you in the next year we will hear a lot more about that. You know, so, you know, without proving that you can actually do it, you know, private sector will not invest. Everybody always says the private sector should invest, but, you know, the private sector will invest when they see that they can get what they need.
How much more proof is required, do you think?
I think we're at the stage now where we have that proof. You know, a portfolio of 143 million. It's a small example, but it's an example that works. You know, it yields a return that private sector investors are interested in, and they need this, you know, because we also shouldn't forget who are private sector investors. Private sector investors are not greedy capitalists, typically. Private sector investors that are actually, you know, eligible for investing in what we need, long-term capital to transform these sectors. They're pension funds, they're insurances, they're family offices, you know, and they need to deliver to the owners of the money their pensions. They need to make sure that the claims that we make to the insurances are being paid. And, you know, so we need to give these private sector investors models in which they can invest that give them the return that they need. We need to show them that it's possible, and only then will we see that private sector money starts to flow. And that's challenging, you know, because if you want to give a private sector investor a 5% return today, what does that translate to into what we have to put to the project? You know, maybe 8, 10%. And, you know, for a 15-year investment, 8, 10%, that's a costly matter. So we have to convince the companies on the ground that they need to shift. They need to make this shift. They need to dare transitioning to sustainable models.
Michael, thank you very much for your honesty there. Juan Carlos, having listened to what has been said, let me put that question to you. I think we sort of agree that the case for nature-based solutions is there. It's absolutely there. But promoting it to the point where others, other businesses, private sector, other individuals, multilateral, development finance institutions, get behind it, there's a gap, you know. So how do you think, from your perspective, it should be promoted, these solutions?
Thank you very much for that question. And I think this question is also very important. So to answer your question, in the case of NBS, the indigenous communities have already engaged in nature-based solutions. We are part of the nature-based solutions. Because we are part of nature. And so the local communities, the indigenous people, are all part of the nature-based solutions. And we see this holistically. Nature, forests, food, we don't look at them separately. For us, it's a holistic one, and they are our life. Forest, land, soil, we're all connected to them. And because of that, it's very difficult for us to see them separately. We look at them holistically. So I think the answer is in the soil. There are various products in the soil. And there are things that are valuable in the soil. And within the soil, I think we could find the nature-based solutions. The local communities, the indigenous people are in these areas trying to live with nature, and we are part of the nature-based solution. We have many things that are beautiful in these forests. And we could say organic, or it could be healthy, but anyway, there are various species of cacao, and there are beautiful things that are like treasures that exist in the forest, and we need to connect them together. We need to create a mechanism, and we need to have a dialogue in order to connect them together. And what must be respected is the respect for nature, and that is the most important thing that I want to emphasize. Or we could have an agreement and maybe sign something, but it's not, it should go beyond that. When we sign an agreement, it means that you will be entering into a partnership with the local community. And that partnership should focus on protection together, and we need to move in the same direction together. And the indigenous people already have nature-based solutions. We are living there, we are living in nature, we are respecting nature.
Thank you very much indeed, Juan Carlos. Thank you. I mean, that was really, really clear. And I suppose the difficulty is that although I think we probably here in this room understand fully and respect what you've said, the contribution, there is a gap between what you're saying and how other people who are not living in the forest, do not appreciate the forest in quite the same way, look to extract the resources, how they see you and how they see what we might call nature-based solutions. It's just transactional, as opposed to connected in the way that you've described. Let me bring our Professor Lawrence back into the conversation here. How on earth do we promote nature-based solutions, forest-based nature-based solutions in practice? Because I'm just thinking, outside of this Congress, will it cut through to other people who could enable us to make real progress between now and the next Congress, but who may not necessarily be convinced and may just see the forests as this source of carbon capture?
I am daunted by the task. You know, I'm daunted when I listen to everyone speaking about this challenge we have to but give the real value. As a scientist, I certainly see the value. In my way, I see it in the data, the numbers, the services are clear, both locally and globally. So for me, it's not a question of, is there value? Of course, I don't think that's at stake here. It's just daunting to think about how to get that value appreciated in the right place. I don't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. What I know is that they are so critical. As we lose them, we lose so much. We lose that spiritual connection. We lose all the climate connections. We lose our ability not only to live now, those of us who live, those 300 million communities that live actually in the forest, they lose that. And we lose our future. So I don't know how we mobilize people to be concerned about the present and the future. I find this quite daunting.
Okay.
So as a scientist and a professor, all I can do is say, we certainly don't need to study it anymore. Yeah. We need to start trying out solutions. And I've heard some pretty exciting options here, from the community-based to the more corporate finance to indigenous solutions. Clearly, we have a bunch of potential solutions. I think we have to start trying.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Deborah. Michael, you caught my eye a moment or two ago when Deborah was saying very honestly she wasn't quite sure. You seem to want to assist, so please do.
Please assist.
I wanted to assist, and you know, I hear you about the problem being daunting, but actually I'm more positive. Yay. Because, you know,
Yay.
25 years ago, when I started my career in this space, you know, I heard the same being said about renewable energy and the energy transition. And look where we are now in the energy transition. I mean, we're not done, and it's not going fast enough, yes. But, you know, it's really a mainstream, you know, for investors, for example, it's mainstream, right? Renewable energy is cheaper than fossil energy in many places. You know, why should that not be possible with sustainable land use, right? We just need to, you know, keep drilling, hammering these solutions that we have. And you know, the solutions are there, and we need to work together, you know. We need the right regulatory frameworks to drive the motivation of companies to change. We need, you know, the right financial incentives so that corporates change. And we need the right remembrance that, you know, there's a spiritual and non-financial value in forests. And, you know, that actually connects to everyone. I think that connects. I haven't met anyone in my entire career who thought forests were just a nuisance, right? Yeah. Everybody likes the forest. People have just different perspectives. And I think, you know, there's exciting ways on how you can work together. We've heard about results-based financing as, you know, something that can help preserve forests. Sure, but, you know, someone needs to finance the activities that lead to the result, right? And if that's not the private sector, then who would that be? So public-private sector, you know, other stakeholders, we can all work together. So I'm positive, maybe not for tomorrow, but for soon.
Okay, well, in that spirit, thank you very much. And now I reach out to you, our colleagues here in the room. You can see there are microphones dotted around to your left and right. And I would invite you now to have a think about what you've heard thus far from our colleagues here on the panel and also on the line, Susan on the line there. If you have a question, it's a gentleman here. Now, there's a microphone behind you, so you can tell us who you are and briefly what your question is, and I will try and direct it to the right person. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Henry. It has been an amazing presentation and also panelists. Thank you so much, distinguished panels.
Thank you.
I have like two questions, I think. Maybe a bit biased to Michael because I've known him for quite some time.
Okay.
You mentioned, my name, by the way, is Fitrian Aldiansya. I'm from IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative. Michael, you mentioned that you've been investing quite a lot recently in agriculture, sustainable agriculture, as a proxy to protect forests. I'm just wondering whether you also can see investment directly in forest protection can be sped up, can be accelerated. Because I think the rate of deforestation is still continuing and also continuing quite fast. I mean, we are playing catching up. What you have done and together also with different organizations is good, but is it really enough? I mean, you mentioned, Henry, this is a boutique type of models.
Yes.
Can we scale it up? And also transforming real investment in forest protections.
And your second question?
The second question is for Professor Deborah Lawrence and also Suzanne. I mean, although you mentioned quite correctly that the values for forests mostly now, I mean, nominal values are associated with carbon emissions reductions, especially through the UNFCCC negotiations. Haven't seen similar discussions taking place at UNCBD, I mean, quite concretely, UNFF and others in terms of providing nominal values for other type of values coming from forests, in which then that kind of investment can take place. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we have a second question? We'll take the gentleman there. Do you want to, can you get to the microphone? So we've had one already, okay, and then you are?
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm Otioe Champon Boache, also from Ghana.
Yeah, with a name like Boache, you have to be. Go on.
Yeah.
The Boaches are from Ghana. Go.
That's true. So
yes.
My question is for Professor Deborah. Just as you ended, you said I'm also an environmental research scientist, and so just as you ended, you said we should try our solutions now, like you ended your speech with. This is my question. What is the scientific community, and that for that matter, the academia, doing to be able to break the science down for society to understand? Because there seems to be a gap. relating science to society has become a problem. And so for us in Ghana and myself, what I'm doing with my students is that we are trying to use the basic science behind tree planting to address the triple planetary crisis. Trees are able to absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. The stalk themselves stores carbon, so it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. And so we have a lot of sanitation-related areas in Ghana. And so how can we address these issues? Trees are able to absorb carbon, and then some odorous compounds. They also are able to release oxygen into the atmosphere. And so if you're able to plant trees in such sanitation-related areas, as the trees are absorbing carbon and sequestering carbon, the oxygen that is released is actually refreshing ambient air, and thereby also absorbing odorous compounds from the atmosphere. Now, in terms of biodiversity loss, trees provide homes and habitat for arboreal organisms like birds. And I've always said this everywhere I stand. Growing up as a kid, I had a natural alarm. I didn't need a phone because the rhymes from the birds in my community woke me up at 5 a.m. in the morning. I lived in Kumasi, and then that we can still identify with the spirituality of trees.
Yes.
Because the name Kumasi itself is coming from a tree that was planted by, let me say, a fetish priest that survived, and that gave the Ashantis their capital town, Kumasi.
Yes.
And so we still believe in the fact that trees are spiritual. And so how can we juxtapose all this with the science thereof? Like I'm sharing with what we are doing. And I'm lucky this particular project won the Forestry Youth Changemaker Award this year. And so that is why I'm here to talk about it more in other sessions. And so,
Boakye, that's beautiful. We should put that speech on YouTube. It will go viral. It was beautiful. Thank you very much indeed, Boakye. I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. As you say in Ghana, you have to land now. Let him land. Deborah, first of all, I mean, wow. How, are you going to follow that? How do we bridge the gap between the science, the data, the way one presents here, and the people out there who could be persuaded to listen, absorb, and then maybe even mobilize?
I do not believe that the science is a problem.
Yeah.
I do not think science is limiting. I think the science has been clear for 30, 40, 50 years. I think our job as teachers and as members of society is to speak the science, to talk about it, to believe in it. You know, we're not supposed to have to believe. But I don't think it's not that there's a need for more science. I think your question is, how do we as teachers and as members of society take that with us into the world? I think that we can teach our students to speak the science, to believe it, to think of it as part of their value kit, that scientific knowledge should be how we make decisions. But I think that our decisions have not been limited by a lack of science. I think they're limited by something else, by values, by, it's just not the science. We have known, all these people in the room who study forests certainly know the value of forests. So that is not what limits us, I don't think. Mm-hmm. It's how we take our science into the world.
And also, Deborah, could you take there was part of the question from our colleague from IDH that was targeted at you as well. You said he's not hearing these conversations in some of the events he goes to. You know, people talk about carbon capture, etc., but they're not presenting it in the way you are. Is that fair? Are you an outlier?
Are you talking about the non-carbon benefits?
Usually the discussion taking place at UNFCCC,
yeah.
but not like UNCBD, UNFF in terms of other physical values.
The physical effects aren't even discussed at the UNFCCC. They are part of the models, so they're hidden. They have not been surfaced even in the UNFCCC. So I think this is something that this should be surfaced everywhere. If it's valuable, if it's helpful. I think if you think about what we're trying to do when we're trying to address climate change, in addition to these others, biodiversity and restoration and all that, if we are trying to keep the surface temperature low, we should be looking at all mechanisms to do that. And in all of those arenas, we simply only focus on carbon. And I would say if we're talking about tenths of a degree, we look at forests for more than just their carbon benefits. We get many tenths of a degree in a given place and at the globe by keeping forests present. So I think that's exciting and important. I don't know how we get it into the UNFCCC conversations, because I don't know how you balance tenths of a degree with gigatons of carbon. This is a problem with that conversation. We don't negotiate tenths of a degree. We don't get credit for tenths of a degree. We get credit for gigatons of carbon. So it's always going to be a challenge, but I think at least bringing these questions up has the potential to make a very interesting conversation between countries where they occur, because those adaptive benefits are huge. The local benefits are huge. So it's a very interesting conversation at the global arena for those countries and for their position in that global conversation.
Let's bring Susan into that, because
Please,
I think...
I was looking for her help.
Yes, I think our colleague wanted you to answer that question as well. Susan.
No, I think that's a very fair point in terms of forests really not taking a center role in the CBD, the UNCCD. Generally, they are recognized, but I think from the very good statistics that we know that Professor Deborah has just elaborated today, but also available in a lot of scientific journals, a lot of reports that we know of, that discussion really doesn't get in place. And then especially for me, worrying is, for instance, on the CBD, I think we look very much in terms of the diversity of species in terms of, so forests are different. You know, we are talking here generally as if forests in the tropical regions are the same as forests in the temperate regions. Even some of the statistics I think that Prof has just mentioned there in terms of albedo effects, you'll find very, sort of significant differences between different kind of forests providing these services. And I think for the CBD, what I find interesting is there's an emphasis, or there's a recognition that we have different kind of species. So for instance, in the tropical regions, the number of species within certain forest biomes will be extremely high. So when you lose them, you lose a high biodiversity, right? But also the wildlife, the other animals that are, protected or staying in the forest then get lost. But what we've seen is that there hasn't been substantial discussions around how do we make that, how do we make then those forests in terms of the diversity of species as well as whatever is stored within those forests, stay. And I think that has been one of the biggest challenges for the biodiversity discussions, that we all recognize forests are great, but we don't have models. Of course, on the UNFCCC side, by pairing forests with carbon, we are seeing now private sector companies as well as governments in areas where there's already historical emissions of carbon willing to pay for carbon. But what we are saying is we need to go beyond that. And then for conventions like the CBD, conventions like UNCCD, again with fantastic statistics showing the role of forests on energy, on water, we should be linking that more closely to desertification and land degradation and paying for that. But I think it's that question of, we recognize the values, yes, but then we are not prepared to compensate for those values to ensure that those forests stay intact. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it's a fair point, and we still need discussions around it and to ensure that it's not just within the UNFCCC, it's also within the UNCCD as well as CBD and other conventions that forests.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. Michael wants to come in. And also, Michael, in your response, can you address the other side of the question from our colleague here from IDH? And he was saying, well, it's great what you're doing, but I mean, we're behind, we need to accelerate this, we need to do more.
Yeah, and he's certainly right. But, first let me just comment on what Susan just said, right? I think you hit the nail on the head. The problem with carbon is you can monetize it. And, that's very attractive because people think, the monetization of carbon is easy. It's actually not, I can tell you from an investor's perspective, from having worked in carbon for a long time. So what are the models through which you can actually compensate, someone for protecting the forest beyond the value of carbon? And I think, there's certainly many models, but, the way we look at this in our fund, in our investment process, is that we actually, we want to know what is the mitigation benefit, but we also want to know what is the adaptation benefit. We want to make sure that we assess, the biodiversity of the forest that is around. We do what is called high conservation value assessments, high carbon stock assessment, to kind of complement high carbon stock assessments. We have our own forest and biodiversity framework, which looks at, ecosystem services, species diversity, etc. beyond. And what is the financial mechanism, or what is the incentive mechanism then? Is the fact that we provide money that is otherwise not available. But I think we need to complement that with regulatory frameworks that drive companies to want to change. I think that's essential, right? If you don't want to change, or if you don't have to change, then you will not change. Even if the money is there to do the change. So we need to provide the money, we need to provide the incentive, and we need to provide the pressure. And I think that pressure needs to come both from the regulatory side, but also from the civil society side, to push that forward, right? And I think, we can also create frameworks that allow us to monetize, what Fitrion has been speaking about, direct forest protection, because that's very difficult today, to, protect a piece of forest and make money from that. But if we are getting Article 6 right under the UNFCCC, right, I think, that opens an avenue with the necessary safeguards that are needed. We can then look at how private sector, public sector work together in results-based financing and financing what is needed to get results. And ultimately, we need to look at sustainable land use and, beyond that, protecting forests really as an asset class that needs to be made attractive so that we can go to scale. Because, right now, we're just not at the scale that has an impact.
Well, thank you, Michael. Quite a few questions and comments are coming in from the Zoom chat, which is great. And somebody, this will be of interest to you, Deborah, because it was inspired by your presentation. This person has no name, saying he or she is really taken with the sobering statistics that forests emit half as much carbon as they store. Can this be mitigated by using more timber products, which store carbon, as long as the trees are used from sustainable forest management? So if you hold on to that one. And then another one came in saying, thanks for your great presentation, highlighting that forests are more than CO2. Not realizing this globally has led to believing that we can cut forests that are not absorbing as much carbon as young forests, i.e. plantations. This is leading to a loss of biodiversity. So that second one was more a reflection. But what about the first question then? Can this be mitigated by using more timber products?
Simple answer is yes.
Yes.
That's a great place to park carbon. Forests are great at taking up carbon. We know that. It's proven technology for carbon removal from the atmosphere. And if we could build buildings with carbon instead of steel, it's a win-win because steel is so energy consumptive. So in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live, we now have the tallest structure that's built from mass timber on the East Coast. It's 10 stories tall. So maybe that's not big enough for Seoul, but 10 stories in many places is a pretty good sized building. So yes, yes, yes. But I would hate to see us cutting a mature forest for large pieces of timber to put into our buildings. Let's be sure to note that not all forests are equal. So if we're going to use timber, let's use the forests that are made for timber, like plantations, and not cut a mature forest. It's such a loss. It's just, of course, the biodiversity, the carbon, everything. It's a huge loss. So I hope we just remember that mature forests are different and special, and that's not where we should get our mass timber. But mass timber is great, and we should build buildings with wood.
Tremendous. Let's get another question or two in. Lady there, yes, in the yellow. There's a microphone there, yes. Yes, you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for today. My name is Terry Reichland. Mask off or on, does it matter, I guess?
It's okay.
Okay. So my question is, what role do women have to play when it comes to, creating that cultural shift, and also when it comes to, let's say, allocation of funds, to protect and restore the forest? Like, should there be a focus on women, and or is there one, or should there be one, basically? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's take a second question. Do we have a second one? Gentleman over there. I don't know. You'll have to come across. So, yeah, the microphone there, yes.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have two questions.
And who are you?
My name is Peter Gondo. I'm from the United Nations Forum on Forest Secretariat.
Yeah.
And I wanted to confirm to our IDH colleague that actually we talk about these things in the UNFF. If you look at Global Forest Goal number 2, it's about sustainable production and use of sustainably produced materials.
Okay.
We are trying to go beyond. But the two questions I have, the first one has to do with the incentives and regulatory framework. As scientists and experts, we talk to ourselves. The people who make the regulatory framework are politicians and legislators. What should we be doing, Michael, to actually convince them to provide the right framework? And to Prof, it's now almost 3 decades we've been trying to come up with evaluation methods and national accounting methods that take into account nature and the value of forests and both the ecosystem services and for the goods and services. But this is not happening. What should we be doing, or what are we doing wrong? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Peter. Our first question, though, what role should women or could women play when it comes to that cultural shift? Susan, first of all, on that. I suspect this is something that you think about quite a lot.
Absolutely, and a brilliant question on gender dynamics, the role of women in cultural shift towards protection of forests, management of forests. Women are a big player in the forestry sector. As I mentioned, especially in rural Africa, they are primarily responsible for cooking food. Some of the areas that we've worked in, like in the Congo Basin, you have 90% of rural households at least depending on energy, on wood kind of energy, either firewood or charcoal in terms of both in the rural actually and even urban areas. Big cities like Kinshasa, just visited there, a city of close to 20 million people. And once you stand on some of those main highways, you're seeing trucks and trucks of charcoal. And then in the rural areas, you're seeing many, many loads of firewood coming from forest areas to be able to provide energy for cooking. So it's a big source of energy for cooking, and women are really, really affected, but as well as agency, they have the agency to be able to drive this cultural shift. So what I'm saying is any kind of forest protection, management, or restoration decision cannot be successful if we don't engage substantively with women. And I'm using the word substantive here because we've seen projects that basically try to count the heads of women that have attended a meeting, whether those women don't say anything, whether those women's ideas and perceptions are not even taken into consideration throughout the meeting. We say we had 50% women attending this meeting. We need to go beyond what we call the descriptive statistics of counting the heads of women to understanding their needs, to understanding their power in changing these decisions. I hear in a lot of meetings, people say, oh, but women in Africa and other places, they're disempowered. They can't talk in meetings. And so we have to really look at ways of getting people who can represent them, even if they can't talk. I want to say that right now, the social science has advanced. We have fantastic tools available for programs, for projects, to look at ways of substantively engaging women so that their decisions, their needs and interests are taken into consideration. But most importantly, that when we design projects or programs, they are also targeting women as beneficiaries. Okay. So that's critical for me. And I think it's important to engage women if we have to have sustainable forest management practices.
Thank you very much, Susan. We are at time, but I just want to quickly, if I can, squeeze in 30 seconds from each of our colleagues, just very quickly to hoover up one or two more thoughts. Juan Carlos, very quickly on that question about the role of women in driving that cultural shift. In Quaker, for example, female participation, meaningful participation. Please tell us.
Creo que eso es un tema sumamente.
In my view, yes, this is a very important agenda for the indigenous community, where we work in a very integrated manner. To our elders, by elders I mean those with much knowledge, the wise. And they are like trees in our community because they already have much and rich information and experience. So we would approach the wise to
discuss what can be done within that culture and community so that women and youth could contribute. And we act as a community. We do not leave anyone behind, and we always move forward all together. This is very important. We must give consideration to a variety of conditions. And when we proceed with a project, we cannot exclude anyone. We share all the information, and we move forward in a transparent manner. And we must work with a very clear set of principles and standards. So if there is an agenda in a household, that agenda does not stay within that household. It applies to the entire community as an integrated principle. And within that community, what kind of change women, youth can bring about, we think of all together as a community, and we act together as a community. So everyone must stand on an equal condition. If there is an information, there are funds, and this is the same for the entire community.
Well, I think, and Deborah, let's deal with the questions from our colleague Peter. Well, first of all, Michael, what do we do to convince the politicians? Because in the end, they're the ones who set the regulatory frameworks. They're the ones who make the decisions.
Well, you know, presumably they want to protect forests. If you look at international declarations signed up by, you know, most countries today. So, but what should the politicians do to protect forests, to enable, you know, from my perspective, private sector investment in this space? I think, you know, a key thing that they need to do is they need to set targets to reduce deforestation in their jurisdictions, and then, you know, follow through with these targets, police them if necessary. I think, you know, one of the challenges we see in many of our interventions is that, you know, maybe we manage to protect the forest here, but because there is a demand for that forest, for firewood or for land, you know, you see deforestation elsewhere. So, you know, I think that's an important element on the one hand. I think another important element around social inclusion, which is really important for ownership of, you know, society, in the wider society, to protect forests and that vision, you know, is to provide land tenure. If you don't have land tenure, you can't get financing. If you can't get financing, you can't use best available technology, best available techniques, which means you have to expand. And you have to, you know, you have to keep on shifting where you cultivate. So I think, you know, those two things maybe I would say are the key things for me. There's of course many more, but you know, those two are certainly very important.
And final word with Prof. Now, I think there was a part of the question for you, Prof. I've forgotten what the question was.
I got the question.
Good.
The question was, you know, 30 years of data.
Yes, that's right.
30 years of information, it's not getting across. And I had an idea.
Yes.
So it is policymakers who need to make these decisions and give us regulatory frameworks. I am sort of heartened by the fact that, at least in my own country, in the United States, we are finally having so many disasters that people are putting it together. And our role as scientists needs to be to make it clear that those disasters are connected to ecosystem services that have failed. If it's the climate system that has failed, we need to make it specific reference. That is not just a magical disaster. That is a disaster that is occurring because an ecosystem service has failed, probably because we have failed. So I think we need to connect. I assume that everyone else is having disasters as well around the world. Those disasters need to be made explicitly connected to our ecosystem services. And it's not just abstract. So it's a specific disaster, has a specific cause, and it has a cost. And if you can make clear that that cost of repair, restoration, or relief, all that money, that's costing policymakers. It costs them money to go in after a disaster. So I think connecting the disaster to the ecosystem service that could avoid it, and to the avoided cost of relief and restoration, that's going to start making a point for us. It's not just an abstract thing about what our ecosystems do for us. It's very clear. And I think our job as scientists is partly to make that connection, to constantly make it concrete.
Very good. That was the last word. Put your hands together for Professor Deborah Lawrence, Juan Carlos Quintiac, Michael Schlupp, and Dr. Susan Chomba. That was your panel. That was the first of this sub-theme 2. 4 more to go during the week. Thank you very much. You're a wonderful and engaged audience. I look forward to seeing you during the rest of the week. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening.